Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance of the upscale charity gala, smoothing down her black evening dress one last time. The ballroom of the Grand Harbor Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and the soft murmur of well-dressed guests. She had been looking forward to this Veteran Support Foundation event for weeks, but now, standing here alone, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. At 28, Sarah worked as a trauma nurse at the local VA hospital. She had saved for months to afford the ticket to tonight's event, believing deeply in the cause. Veterans meant everything to her, though most people wouldn't understand why just by looking at her. She appeared to be just another young professional in a sea of wealthy donors and military officials. Sarah's long dark hair was pulled back in an elegant bun, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. But it also revealed something else, the edge of a tattoo that crept up from her shoulder blade, disappearing under the fabric of her dress. The intricate black ink was partially visible, showing what appeared to be military dog tags and part of what looked like a memorial design. As she walked through the crowd, balancing a small clutch purse and trying to navigate in heels she rarely wore, Sarah noticed the stares. They weren't the kind of appreciative glances she might have expected at such an event. Instead, they were looks of disapproval, judgment, and barely concealed disgust. "Can you believe someone would come to an event like this with a tattoo showing?" whispered Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the wife of a prominent businessman, to her companion. She didn't bother to lower her voice much. "It's so inappropriate. This is supposed to be a classy affair." Her friend, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, nodded vigorously. "Absolutely shocking. In my day, young ladies had more respect for formal occasions. That ink makes her look like she belongs in some biker bar, not at a charity gala supporting our brave servicemen." Sarah felt heat creep up her neck. She had debated wearing a dress that would completely cover her tattoo, but this was the only formal dress she owned that fit properly. She had hoped that at an event supporting veterans, people might be more understanding of military-related ink. She was wrong. As she made her way to the silent auction tables, hoping to blend into the crowd, the comments continued. A distinguished gentleman in a navy suit leaned over to his wife and muttered, "What is this world coming to? No class whatsoever. Someone should have dress codes for these events." Sarah picked up her auction paddle with the number 47 and tried to focus on the items being offered. There were vacation packages, artwork, and various military memorabilia. She was particularly interested in a signed photograph of a military unit, though she knew she probably couldn't afford to bid on it. Behind her, a group of younger attendees had noticed her tattoo as well. "Oh my God, look at that," one of them said, not bothering to whisper. She seriously came to a military charity event with gang tattoos showing. How disrespectful is that? "I know, right?" replied her friend, a woman in an expensive red dress. "Like, read the room. This is about honoring our heroes, not showing off your rebellious phase." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she set down her paddle. She knew what her tattoo actually was, what it meant, but she had learned over the years that explaining it to strangers often made things worse. People had their minds made up the moment they saw the dark ink on her skin. The evening continued with Sarah moving quietly through the crowd, trying to participate in the auction and support the cause she cared so deeply about. But the whispers and stares followed her everywhere. A server even approached her at one point and asked if she was sure she was at the right event, suggesting that maybe she was looking for one of those alternative music venues downtown. During the cocktail hour, Sarah found herself standing alone by the large windows overlooking the harbor. The view was beautiful, with boats bobbing in the moonlight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. She had enough money for maybe one small bid, and she wanted to contribute something meaningful to the veterans organization, but the constant judgment was wearing her down. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a stern-faced woman in her 60s, dripping with jewelry and authority. I'm Margaret Thornton, and I'm on the board of this foundation. Sarah's heart sank. Yes, ma'am? I couldn't help but notice your decoration, Mrs. Thornton said, her eyes pointedly looking at Sarah's shoulder. While I'm sure you paid for your ticket like everyone else, I have to say that your choice to display that tattoo is quite inappropriate for an event of this caliber. We're here to honor the dignity and sacrifice of our service members. I understand your concern, Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion building inside her. But I assure you, I have nothing but respect for service members. Mrs. Thornton's expression softened slightly, but only slightly. I'm sure you do, dear. But presentation matters. When we're raising money for veterans' medical care and support services, we need to project a certain image. That artwork sends the wrong message about what kind of people support our military. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Here she was, at an event supporting the very people she had dedicated her career to helping, being told she wasn't worthy to be among the supporters because of her appearance. Perhaps, Mrs. Thornton continued, you might consider covering it up somehow. I'm sure someone has a shawl you could borrow. We want all our guests to feel comfortable, and frankly, several people have mentioned feeling uncomfortable with such a prominent display of body art. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Thornton had already walked away, clearly considering the matter settled. Sarah stood there, staring out at the water, fighting back tears. She had come here tonight hoping to contribute to a cause that meant everything to her. Instead, she was being made to feel like an unwelcome intruder. The dinner portion of the evening began, and Sarah found herself seated at a table toward the back of the room. Her table mates were polite but distant, clearly having heard the gossip about the inappropriately tattooed guest. Conversation flowed around her without including her, discussions about country club memberships and vacation homes and children's private school achievements. Sarah picked at her chicken dinner, listening to the conversations and feeling increasingly isolated. When the auction began in earnest, she watched as items sold for amounts that exceeded her monthly rent. The signed military photograph she had been interested in went for $3,000 to a couple who seemed more interested in how it would look in their home office than in its historical significance. As the evening wore on, Sarah noticed more and more people staring at her tattoo and whispering. A few bold individuals even pointed discreetly in her direction while talking to their companions. She began to wonder if coming here had been a terrible mistake. Maybe she should have stayed home, made a donation online, and avoided the humiliation entirely. But there was something inside Sarah that refused to be ashamed. She knew the truth about her tattoo, about why she had gotten it, about what it represented. These people could judge her all they wanted, but they had no idea what they were actually looking at. During the brief intermission before the main speech, Sarah excused herself and went to the ladies' room. She stood in front of the ornate mirror, looking at her reflection and the visible portion of her tattoo. In the bright lights of the bathroom, she could see it more clearly than the other guests could. The carefully crafted details, the meaningful symbols, the dates and names that meant everything to her. Two women entered the bathroom behind her, still talking about her. I just don't understand why someone like that would even want to come to an event like this, one of them was saying. It's like she's trying to make some kind of statement. Probably one of those attention seekers, the other replied. You know the type. Gets tattoos to shock people and then plays the victim when people react appropriately. Sarah dried her hands slowly, meeting their eyes in the mirror. For a moment she considered saying something, explaining herself, defending her choices. But she had learned that people who were determined to judge rarely wanted to hear the truth. Instead, she simply smiled politely and left the bathroom. Back in the ballroom, the main speaker was being introduced. Sarah returned to her seat, resigned to enduring the rest of the evening in uncomfortable silence. The MC was talking about sacrifice, honor, and the debt that civilians owed to those who served in the military. All around her, people nodded solemnly, many of the same people who had been criticizing her all evening for her apparent lack of respect. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the attendees. There were several military officers present, distinguished men and women in their dress uniforms. There were wealthy civilians who supported military causes, politicians who posed for photos with veterans during election season, and society figures who attended these events as much for the social aspect as for the charitable cause. And then there was her, the trauma nurse who worked with veterans every single day, who had chosen her career specifically to serve those who had served their country, who understood their struggles and their pain in ways that most of these well-dressed donors never would. Yet she was the one being treated as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong among the supporters of the military. The irony wasn't lost on her. As she sat there listening to speech after speech about honoring veterans and supporting those who sacrificed for freedom, she was being ostracized by the very people claiming to champion those values, all because of a tattoo they didn't understand and hadn't bothered to ask about. The evening was about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. In just a few minutes, a man would walk to the podium who would change everything about how the room saw Sarah Martinez. But for now, she sat quietly in the back, surrounded by judgment and whispers, holding on to the knowledge of what her tattoo really meant and why she had every right to be there. The final speaker was being introduced, and Sarah noticed a stir of excitement in the room. Apparently, this was someone important, someone whose presence was considered a real honor for the event. She couldn't see him yet from her seat in the back, but she could sense the elevated energy in the room as people straightened in their chairs and turned their attention to the stage. Sarah adjusted her dress slightly, unconsciously trying to hide more of her tattoo, and prepared to listen to what would surely be another speech about supporting veterans from someone who had probably never spent a day working directly with them. She had no idea that her entire evening and her life was about to change completely. Commander Jake "Reaper" Thompson stepped up to the podium with the confident bearing of a man who had led elite military operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet authority that came from years of command responsibility and life-or-death decisions. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, his ribbons and badges telling the story of multiple deployments and commendations earned through courage under fire. The room fell into respectful silence as Commander Thompson adjusted the microphone. Sarah could see him now from her position in the back, and like everyone else in the room, she was struck by his commanding presence. Here was a man who clearly embodied everything this charity gala was meant to honor, a real warrior who had served his country with distinction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Thompson began, his voice carrying easily through the large ballroom, "I want to thank you all for your support of our veterans tonight. Your generosity makes a real difference in the lives of men and women who have given everything in service to this nation." Applause filled the room, and Sarah found herself clapping along despite her uncomfortable evening. Whatever else was happening, this was still about supporting veterans, and that cause remained close to her heart. Commander Thompson continued, "I've been asked to speak to you tonight about sacrifice, about honor, and about the bonds that tie our military family together. But I want to talk to you about something else as well, about recognition, and about how sometimes the most meaningful tributes come from places we least expect." As he spoke, Commander Thompson's eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled crowd of donors and supporters. Sarah noticed that his gaze seemed to linger for a moment on her section of the room, but she assumed he was just making eye contact with the audience, as any good speaker would do. "In my 20 years of service," the commander went on, "I've learned that respect and honor aren't always found in the most obvious places. Sometimes the people who understand sacrifice the most are those who carry its weight quietly, without fanfare, without expectation of recognition. Mrs. Pemberton leaned over to her companion and whispered, "What a distinguished man. Now this is the kind of person who should be speaking at events like this. Not like that tattooed girl who somehow got in here." Sarah heard the comment and felt the familiar sting of judgment. Even during a speech about honor and recognition, she was still being criticized and dismissed. She began to wonder if she should just leave early, slip out during the applause, and avoid any more uncomfortable encounters. Commander Thompson was telling a story now about a mission in Afghanistan where his unit had been pinned down by enemy fire. "We were in a situation where communication with base was impossible," he said, "and we had wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. It was one of those moments where you realize that all your training comes down to split-second decisions that will determine who lives and who dies." The room was completely captivated. Even the people who had been whispering about Sarah were now focused entirely on the commander's words. Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite her discomfort with the evening. "We had a medic with us," Commander Thompson continued, "Corporal Danny Martinez, 22 years old, from a small town in Texas. This kid had joined the military to serve his country and to earn money for medical school. He wanted to be a doctor to help people, and he saw military service as a way to learn and to give back at the same time." Sarah's breath caught. The name Martinez wasn't uncommon, but something about the way Commander Thompson said it, the reverence in his voice, made her pay closer attention. "Corporal Martinez made a decision that night that saved 3 of my men's lives," the commander said, his voice becoming quieter, more personal. "We were taking heavy fire, and our wounded were in an exposed position. Danny left cover, ran into the open under enemy fire, and began treating the wounded soldiers where they had fallen. He refused to move to safety until he had stabilized all 3 men. The room was completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving around the room to listen to the story. "A sniper's bullet found Danny while he was working on the 3rd soldier," Commander Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was hit in the chest, but he didn't stop. He finished treating that wounded Marine, got him stable for transport, and only then did he allow himself to be treated. By then, it was too late. Corporal Danny Martinez died that night, but not before saving 3 lives." Sarah's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Around her, people were dabbing at their eyes with napkins, moved by the story of heroism and sacrifice. But Sarah was feeling something much more intense than sympathy for a stranger's story. Commander Thompson paused, looking out over the crowd. Danny Martinez posthumously received the Silver Star for his actions that night. But more than that, he received something that can't be given by the military or the government. He received the eternal gratitude and love of his fellow soldiers and of his family, who understood that he had died doing exactly what he had always wanted to do, saving lives and serving others. The applause was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. Her mind was reeling, memories flooding back of conversations with her brother Danny, of his dreams of becoming a doctor, of his pride in serving his country, of the phone call she had received 3 years ago that had changed her life forever. When the applause died down, Commander Thompson continued his speech, but Sarah was no longer listening to the words. She was remembering her brother's funeral, the folded flag presented to their mother, the military honor guard, and the promise she had made at his graveside. She was remembering the day she had gone to the tattoo artist, carrying photographs and military documents and her brother's dog tags. She was remembering the hours spent in that chair, having her brother's memory permanently etched into her skin, his name, his unit designation, his dates of service, and a memorial design that incorporated symbols of his medical training and his military service. Sarah's tattoo wasn't gang ink or a rebellious statement or an inappropriate display of body art. It was a memorial to her fallen brother, a trauma medic who had died saving the lives of his fellow soldiers. Every line of ink represented her love for Danny, her pride in his service, and her commitment to continuing his mission of helping others. The irony of the evening crashed over her like a wave. Here she was, at an event honoring veterans, being criticized and judged for carrying a memorial to a Silver Star recipient on her body. The very people who were applauding Commander Thompson's story about heroism and sacrifice had been treating her like an unwelcome intruder all evening. Commander Thompson was finishing his speech now, talking about the importance of supporting veterans and their families, about the ongoing cost of freedom, and about the need for civilians to understand and appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf. The words seemed to be directed straight at Sarah, though she knew the commander had no way of knowing her story. In closing, Commander Thompson said, "I want to remind all of us that honor and respect take many forms. Sometimes the most profound tributes are the ones that aren't immediately visible or understood. Sometimes the people who care the most are the ones who carry their dedication quietly, without seeking recognition or praise." As the applause began again, Commander Thompson's eyes swept the room once more. This time, Sarah was certain that his gaze found her and held for just a moment longer than it should have. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Was it recognition? Understanding? Or was she imagining things in her emotional state? The formal program was ending, and people were beginning to stand and mingle again. Sarah remained seated, trying to process everything that had just happened. She felt emotionally drained from the evening's experiences, from being judged and criticized, and now from hearing her brother's story told by someone who had been there, who had known him, who understood exactly what kind of man Danny Martinez had been. Mrs. Thornton, the board member who had confronted Sarah earlier about her tattoo, was making her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations on the successful event. She approached Sarah's table with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you enjoyed the speeches," Mrs. Thornton said, though her tone suggested she was more interested in making sure Sarah was planning to leave soon. "Commander Thompson certainly gave us a powerful reminder of what real sacrifice looks like." Sarah looked up at her, feeling a surge of emotion that she struggled to control. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did." "It really puts things in perspective, doesn't it?" Mrs. Thornton continued. "When you hear about genuine heroes like that young medic, it makes you realize how important it is to honor our military properly, to show them the respect they deserve in our behavior and our presentation." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt something snap inside her. Here was this woman who had spent the evening criticizing Sarah for her tattoo, now lecturing her about respecting the military while completely ignorant of the fact that Sarah's tattoo was a memorial to the very hero whose story had just been told. "You're absolutely right," Sarah said, standing up from her chair. "Danny Martinez was a genuine hero, and you're right that we should honor our military properly." Mrs. Thornton seemed pleased by what she interpreted as Sarah's agreement with her position. "Exactly. I'm glad you understand. Sometimes young people need to hear these stories to really appreciate what appropriate respect looks like." Sarah felt tears building in her eyes, but she also felt something else. A growing anger at the ignorance and assumptions that had made her evening so painful. These people claimed to support veterans while treating a veteran's sister with disdain. They applauded stories of sacrifice while criticizing the very memorial that honored that sacrifice. Around them, the crowd was beginning to thin out. Commander Thompson had been surrounded by admirers and donors wanting to shake his hand and thank him for his service and his speech. Sarah could see him across the room, still in conversation with a group of enthusiastic supporters. Part of her wanted to approach him, to tell him who she was, to explain her connection to the story he had told. But another part of her was afraid that even he might judge her for her tattoo, afraid that she might somehow diminish her brother's memory by revealing their relationship, afraid that she wasn't worthy to claim connection to a Silver Star recipient. Mrs. Thornton was still talking, apparently warming to her theme about proper respect and appropriate behavior. "I hope tonight has been educational for you, dear. Events like this are really about understanding the gravity of military service and showing our support in ways that honor the dignity of our servicemen and women." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She was caught between wanting to educate this ignorant woman and wanting to escape before she said something she might regret. The evening had been emotionally overwhelming, and she wasn't sure she could handle much more. Across the room, she noticed that Commander Thompson had extracted himself from the group of admirers and was making his way toward the exit. In a few minutes, he would be gone, and with him would go her chance to ever speak with someone who had known her brother, who had been there during his final moments, who could tell her things about Danny that she would never learn anywhere else. Sarah made a decision. Excusing herself from Mrs. Thornton's lecture, she began to make her way across the room, weaving through the dispersing crowd. She wasn't sure what she would say to Commander Thompson, or if she would have the courage to say anything at all, but she knew she couldn't let him leave without at least trying to connect with him. As she walked, she was aware of the continued stares and whispers her tattoo was generating. But for the first time all evening, she didn't care. She was thinking about Danny, about his courage and his sacrifice, and about the memorial she carried that honored his memory. Let them stare. Let them judge. They had no idea what they were really looking at. Sarah's heart pounded as she navigated through the thinning crowd, trying to reach Commander Thompson before he left the ballroom. She could see him near the exit, shaking hands with a few final well-wishers, and she quickened her pace, despite her unfamiliar heels. Just as she was about 10 feet away from him, Commander Thompson turned and their eyes met directly. There was immediate recognition in his gaze, not of her personally, but of something else. His eyes moved briefly to her shoulder, to the visible portion of her tattoo, and Sarah saw his expression change completely. He said something quick to the people he was with and began walking directly toward her. Sarah stopped where she was, suddenly uncertain. Around them, conversations continued as people gathered their things and prepared to leave, but Sarah felt like the world had narrowed to just her and the approaching SEAL commander. "Excuse me?" Commander Thompson said when he reached her, his voice gentle but intense. "I couldn't help but notice." He gestured slightly toward her shoulder. "May I ask about your tattoo?" Sarah's mouth went dry. This was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading all evening. It's a memorial," she managed to say. Commander Thompson's eyes filled with understanding. "For Danny Martinez?" Tears immediately sprang to Sarah's eyes at the sound of her brother's name spoken by this man who had known him, who had been there. She could only nod, not trusting her voice. "You're his sister," Commander Thompson said, and it wasn't a question. "Sarah, Danny talked about you all the time. He was so proud of you for becoming a nurse. He said you were his inspiration for wanting to go into medicine." The tears were flowing freely now. "You really knew him?" "Danny saved my life that night," Commander Thompson said, his own voice thick with emotion. "He was working on Sergeant Williams when the sniper's bullet hit him. But he looked up at me. I was wounded too, not as badly. And he said, 'Tell my sister Sarah that I kept my promise. Tell her I helped people.'" Sarah's knees nearly buckled. She had never heard those words before, had never known about her brother's final message. Commander Thompson steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. "I've been looking for you for 3 years," he continued. "I tried to reach out through official channels after the funeral, but the addresses I had were old. Danny always said he wanted me to meet his sister, the one who was going to save lives just like he was." By now, people around them had begun to notice the emotional conversation taking place. Mrs. Thornton, who had been watching Sarah's progress across the room with disapproval, approached with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, clearly thinking that perhaps the inappropriately tattooed guest was bothering the distinguished speaker. Commander Thompson turned to face Mrs. Thornton and the small group that had gathered. His bearing shifted back into his command presence, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the remaining crowd with unmistakable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly enough that conversations throughout the ballroom began to quiet. "If I could have your attention for just one more moment." The room gradually fell silent as people turned to see what was happening. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never wanted, but Commander Thompson's presence beside her gave her strength. "Tonight I told you about Corporal Danny Martinez, a hero who gave his life saving his fellow soldiers," Commander Thompson continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "What I didn't tell you is that Danny's family continues his mission of service every single day." He gestured towards Sarah. "This is Sarah Martinez, Danny's sister. She's a trauma nurse at the VA hospital, where she spends her days caring for wounded veterans. And that tattoo that I've noticed some of you commenting on tonight? It's not gang ink or a fashion statement. It's a memorial to her brother, the Silver Star recipient whose story moved you all to tears just a few minutes ago." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could see the shock and embarrassment on the faces of people who had been whispering about her all evening. Mrs. Pemberton looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Mrs. Thornton's face had gone completely white. Commander Thompson wasn't finished. "Sarah's tattoo includes Danny's name, his unit designation, his dates of service, and symbols representing his work as a combat medic. It's one of the most meaningful military tributes I've ever seen, created by a sister who wanted to carry her brother's memory with her always." He turned to face Sarah directly. "Danny would be so proud of who you've become," he said, his voice gentler now but still audible throughout the room. "He always said his sister was going to change the world by helping people, one patient at a time. I've heard about the work you do at the VA hospital. You're living up to everything he believed about you." Sarah was crying openly now, but she no longer cared who was watching. "I just wanted to honor him," she said. "I wanted to make sure his sacrifice was never forgotten." "And you have," Commander Thompson replied. "Every day you go to work, every veteran you care for, every time someone sees that tattoo and learns Danny's story, you're honoring him." The commander turned back to address the room. "I want everyone here to understand something. This woman has given more to support veterans than most people will give in a lifetime. She's dedicated her career to caring for wounded warriors. She's turned her grief into service, her loss into a mission to help others." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And she was judged tonight, criticized, and made to feel unwelcome, because some of you couldn't see past her appearance to understand what you were really looking at. You were looking at the sister of a hero, a woman who carries his memory in the most permanent way possible and who lives her life in service to the same values he died protecting." The shame on people's faces was visible now. Mrs. Thornton stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I owe you an apology," she said to Sarah. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry for my behavior tonight." Others began to murmur similar apologies, but Commander Thompson held up his hand for silence. "The apologies are appreciated, but they're not the point. The point is that we need to be better than this. We can't claim to support veterans while judging the families who love them. We can't honor sacrifice while dismissing the people who carry that sacrifice forward." He moved to stand directly beside Sarah, his commanding presence now clearly protective of her. "Sarah Martinez doesn't need your approval or your acceptance, but this organization, this cause, needs people like her, people who understand service from the inside out, people who live these values instead of just writing checks to support them." Commander Thompson's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "I've served with heroes in combat zones around the world, and I can tell you, that heroism isn't always found where you expect it. Sometimes it's found in a young medic who dies saving his brothers in arms. Sometimes it's found in a nurse who spends her days helping wounded veterans heal. And sometimes it's found in someone who honors a fallen hero by carrying his memory on her skin and in her heart. The room was completely silent except for the soft sounds of people crying. The weight of Commander Thompson's words, the power of Danny's story, and the revelation of Sarah's true identity had created a moment of profound recognition and shame. Sarah found her voice. "I didn't come here tonight for recognition," she said, addressing the room for the first time. "I came here because I believe in supporting veterans, because I see every day how much they need our help. My brother died believing in service before self, and I try to live by that same principle." She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I work at the VA hospital because I want to honor Danny's memory by helping the men and women who serve alongside him. Every day I see veterans who are struggling, who are in pain, who need people who understand what they've been through. That's why I do what I do, and that's why I'm here tonight." Commander Thompson nodded approvingly. "And that's exactly what Danny would have wanted. He used to say that military families serve too, in their own way. Sarah has been serving right alongside her brother from the day he enlisted, and she's continued serving even after his death." Mrs. Thornton stepped closer, tears in her eyes. "I am so ashamed of how I treated you tonight," she said to Sarah. I completely failed to live up to the values this organization is supposed to represent. You've been honoring veterans while I've been... She couldn't finish the sentence. "It's okay," Sarah said, though her voice still carried the hurt from the evening's experiences. "I understand that people make assumptions, but I hope tonight shows why it's important to ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions." Commander Thompson addressed the room one final time. "I want everyone here to know that Sarah Martinez represents the very best of what we're trying to support tonight. She's a veteran's family member who has turned her loss into service, her grief into purpose. She deserves not just your respect, but your gratitude." He turned to Sarah. "And I want you to know that Danny's unit, his brothers in arms, we've never forgotten him. We meet every year on the anniversary of that night in Afghanistan, and we always talk about the medic who saved our lives. But now I have something even better to tell them. I can tell them about the sister who carries his memory forward, who saves lives every day in his honor." The spontaneous applause that erupted was unlike anything that had happened earlier in the evening. This wasn't polite charity gala clapping. This was genuine emotion, respect, and admiration. People were standing, many of them crying, as they applauded not just Sarah but what she represented. Through her tears, Sarah could see the faces around the room. The judgment and dismissal from earlier had been replaced by respect, understanding, and in many cases, shame for how they had behaved. Mrs. Burida Pemberton was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even the young people who had made snarky comments earlier looked genuinely moved and embarrassed. When the applause finally died down, Commander Thompson spoke more quietly, but his words still carried throughout the room. "Sarah, I know this evening hasn't been easy for you, but I want you to know that Danny would be proud, not just of your work, but of how you've handled yourself tonight with dignity and grace, even when you were being treated unfairly." Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed by the evening's emotional turns. "Thank you for telling me about his last words," she said. "That means more to me than you could ever know." "He kept his promise," Commander Thompson said, "and so have you. You've both helped people, just like you promised each other you would." As the crowd began to disperse again, this time with a very different energy than before, people approached Sarah with genuine apologies and expressions of gratitude. Mrs. Thornton took her aside and personally invited her to join the Foundation's board, recognizing that they needed her perspective and expertise. Several veterans in attendance sought her out, sharing their own stories and thanking her for her work at the VA hospital. What had begun as an evening of isolation and judgment had transformed into something else entirely. A recognition of service, a lesson about assumptions, and a tribute to the memory of a fallen hero. Commander Thompson stayed beside Sarah throughout these interactions, ensuring that she felt supported and protected. When the crowd finally thinned enough for them to speak privately, he pulled out his phone. "I want to give you my contact information," he said. "Danny's unit would love to meet you. We've been telling his story for 3 years, but we've never been able to tell his sister how much he meant to us." As they exchanged information, Sarah felt a sense of connection and belonging that had nothing to do with charity galas or formal events. This was about family, the family Danny had chosen in the military and the family he had left behind. "There's one more thing," Commander Thompson said. "Danny had a last letter that he wrote before that final mission. It was in his gear when we recovered him. It's addressed to you, but it took me 3 years to find you to deliver it." Sarah's breath caught. Another message from her brother. Another connection to the man whose memory she carried every day. "I'd like to give it to you in person when you're ready," he continued. "And I'd like you to meet the men whose lives your brother saved. They've been wanting to thank his family for 3 years." As the evening finally came to an end, Sarah walked out of the Grand Harbor Hotel with her head held high. The same tattoo that had caused her to be judged and criticized just hours earlier was now recognized for what it had always been, a memorial to a hero, created by someone who understood service and sacrifice from the inside out. The valet brought her modest car around, and as she drove home through the quiet streets, Sarah thought about Danny, about the promise they had made to each other to help people, and about the community of brothers in arms who had never forgotten him. She thought about the letter she would soon read, the words Danny had written for her before his final mission. But most of all, she thought about the lesson the evening had taught, that honor and respect come in many forms, that assumptions can blind us to truth, and that sometimes the people who care the most are the ones carrying their dedication quietly, without seeking recognition or praise. Sarah Martinez went home that night knowing that she had honored her brother's memory not just through her tattoo, but through her dignity, her service, and her refusal to be ashamed of carrying a hero's legacy on her skin and in her heart. And tomorrow she would go back to work at the VA hospital, continuing the mission she and Danny had promised each other they would fulfill, helping people, saving lives, and serving those who had served their country. The tattoo that had made her an outcast had ultimately revealed her to be exactly what she had always been, the sister of a Silver Star recipient, a woman dedicated to serving veterans, and a living memorial to the values of courage, service, and sacrifice that her brother had died protecting.